Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Social Media and Politics Podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Associate Professor of Communication at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on X at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. This episode is going to be focused on teaching political communication. It's something I've been wanting to do for a while, and it reflects a lot of the work that I've been doing the past couple years, where we've had these data closures around social media. And rather than sort of deal with that uncertainty, I've put a lot of effort into thinking about how can we create assignments and teach a challenging subject like political communication more effectively, given that the landscape is sort of changing constantly, the political environment is going through all this turbulence. How can we design and teach better as a community? Because teaching is something that's often not talked about. So this episode is definitely more for the academics, but I encourage the practitioners and anyone else to stick around for at least the first 15 minutes, because I think that the second thing I'll present, which is a game that simulates the oversight board, could be a useful workshop exercise to get participants or students to really internalize the complexities of how regulators are dealing with the social media landscape. So that'll become clearer in a second, but the format of this episode will be as follows. So I'm going to present 3 initiatives, and so I wanted to kind of group them together in one episode, where the first is going to be about a database for sharing political communication teaching materials. That's open to the public, so it could be interested for anyone who needs to design a talk on social media to check out. The second is the Meta Oversight Board role-playing game. And the third is definitely more for the academics. That is an assignment developed specifically for the classroom that I call a counterfactual case study, where students have to argue how a major political event would change or not with the inclusion of social media. So I'm going to try to keep this brief. I'm going to try to keep it interesting and go through each of these 3 initiatives, where the logic is that they all have sort of materials that are associated with them. And for the most part, those are open. And so there'll be links down in the episode description where you can access, read more about these initiatives, and hopefully download and use them in your own events or classes. But to provide a bit of an intro into this, and maybe for those who are not academics, to kind of see why using this platform I think is important, is the amount of training that we get for research relative to the amount of training and emphasis placed on teaching is completely out of whack. So as researchers, we receive so much training starting at the bachelor's level, right? In terms of what makes a good research question, what makes a good method, what makes a good research design. So we have courses, we have lots of informal channels like mentorship and supervision, things like workshops, conferences, even the process of peer review itself is very much about informally creating and communicating the standards for what makes solid and publishable research. On the other hand, when it comes to teaching, it's a completely different ballgame. There's very little to no training, there's very little oversight, and there's very little emphasis. And so I think many academics are practicing their teaching in silos, but there's no real incentive and there's no real platform to communicate and cross-communicate and develop the standards for what actually makes a good course, what makes a good assignment, what makes for a good assessment of learning. So just to give you an example from my own experience, in the Swedish system at the doctoral level, there is some required coursework around teaching. You have to take some courses that teach you about what are some good principles of course design, what are some good principles for assessing learning, how do you deal with students from different backgrounds, different abilities, teaching different types of disabilities. Whereas where I did my training in Denmark, there was no required pedagogical training. And it's kind of crazy to think about, but you had to teach 3 semesters. If you couldn't teach in Danish, which let's be real, even though I studied it for a bit, that is a tough language to be proficient in teaching. Then you were tasked with designing your own 15-credit master's course. So I did that with no training in course design, with no training in teaching. And I mean, it went fine. I did it for 3 semesters, but it's kind of crazy to think about how little emphasis was placed on teaching then, and in particular, teaching a particular topic like political communication versus the emphasis placed into research. And I know that my situation is not unique by any means. So as a teacher starting out, it would be helpful if the institution that you're employed at doesn't provide the structure. Then I think that as a community of scholars around political communication, we can sort of take the initiative and build something that, at least from my own experience, I know would be very helpful to see some examples of lecture slides, to see what other people are doing for seminars around similar topics that I'm teaching. So that brings us to the first initiative I want to talk about, which is the Political Communication Teaching Database. And this is something I've been working on with Dr. Isabella Consalves from the University of Mainz, who's done a great job figuring out the kind of architecture and technical solutions for bringing this platform live. And what it is a way for scholars and teachers to upload their course materials. And what the database does is it helps to index those materials by things like what language are the course materials in? What level of instruction are they for? Bachelor's, master's, PhD. And we also provide something like 50 keywords that you can tag these files with in terms of what areas of political communication are they relevant for. Is it teaching things like social movements and activism, or political campaigns, or quantitative methods or qualitative methods? So the way this actually works is it doesn't actually store any files. What an uploader does is they create a link to a folder where the files are, something like Google Drive or Dropbox, and they upload that link to the database and then tag it according to the various criteria that I've just outlined. So that's kind of nice because what it does is it allows you to update those files on your end. It's just the link that's in the database. So some of you may have seen me posting about this or heard a little bit about it. It's kind of been in a soft launch phase, and now we're ready to sort of take it live because we wanted to collect some initial submissions. I think we have 9 or 10 now. So thanks to anyone listening who's uploaded. And now we're hoping, now that people can see a little bit what's on there, that it will sort of begin to kind of snowball and collect more and more submissions, because it's only successful really if people upload more materials to it. So again, check the episode description for each of those links, which is one to the database and one to the upload platform. There are little guides that kind of walk you through the process. And one thing I would flag is that it is not really meant to be looked at on a mobile device. So do check it out when you're on a desktop, and you can click on the database, the tab Teaching Materials, and you'll get a feel for what's already out there. So that's the first initiative. Maybe it's interesting also for others to go and see what's on the platform, which brings me to an important point. And something we discussed a lot was, should we make this password protected? And it's just simply too complicated to create a whole series of usernames and passwords and 2 factors and security. So that's just to say that anything that's uploaded there will more or less be public. So especially in the context of the US right now, it's kind of important to think, is there anything in your teaching materials that could be construed as, one of these issues where the government comes to pull your funding, especially if you're teaching issues around gender or race. So just to flag that. But otherwise, do go check out what is on the database already and consider uploading your own materials. I think it's probably more a source of inspiration than pure application, in the sense that it may be difficult to take what someone else has developed and use it automatically in your classroom without adapting it a bit, because we all have different numbers of students, different class lengths, different norms around assessment, different topics that we teach. So yeah, I think that's probably the main point of the database, is to get some inspiration and to draw from that in developing your own course materials. And just the last thing I'll say on this is it really only works if people upload. And it does take a little bit of time to reformat your files so that they are presentable and interpretable for others to read. If you go into any of the folders that I actually use for teaching, I think I'm the only person who can understand them because they're such a mess and everything is named, different things with specific course codes that someone from another university would have no idea what they mean. So it takes a little bit of effort to format those folders, but I think it's worth it in the broader arc of the bigger mission. So that was the political communication teaching database. The second thing I want to talk about is the Meta Oversight Board role-playing game. So this is something I developed with Dr. John Gibfried at the University of Vienna. And what it is a roughly 1-hour seminar or workshop activity that simulates the process of the oversight board deciding whether to remove or take down political posts using real cases from the oversight board. And the logic here for teaching and learning is that it's one thing to read about a case of content moderation in the news, but it's another one to be placed into a role where you have to argue a position that you may not necessarily agree with. And there's an entire pedagogy and series of games that have been developed around this method called Reacting to the Past, which usually focuses on historical events. They're usually multiple weeks long. So you can play through the French Revolution or the process of Indian independence, where students get super, super engaged. And there's lots of empirical research showing that this type of being assigned a role and having to speak in front of the class really encourages students to read and prepare and be engaged in class. And there's sort of indirect evidence that this supports learning. So I wanted to make one of these games, but I have no idea how to actually do that. And that's where I contacted Dr. Gibfried at the University of Vienna, who is a medieval historian and has created number of these games around, for example, the Fourth Crusade. So I went to visit him on an Erasmus Plus grant where we sort of hammered out the general concept of the game. And I think it's just crazy that the first test run of this game was done to medieval history students in Vienna who were great sports. But the idea behind the game is that there are two playable scenarios. So you can play scenario 1, or you can play scenario 2, or you can play scenario 1 and 2 back to back. The first scenario deals with speech from politicians. So the cases are political speech from the former dictator of Cambodia paired with a case from a Pakistani parliamentary speech. And then the second scenario deals with protest speech, and that is with a protest in Colombia as well as in Iran. So the idea was to take cases that are outside of the US context. We had originally planned to build the entire game around the banning of Donald Trump, but that was just seen as too polarizing and also too non-interesting for students outside of the United States who aren't familiar with American civics. So these cases are sort of far away, and that has the added benefit of feeding into the roles where students feel more comfortable debating cases that are a little bit farther from their context, because no one, at least in Western Europe or Northern Europe, is really familiar with the political context of Cambodia. So it focuses more on the ideological debate rather than any sort of political sensitivities tied to the context where at least I'm teaching. And so the way this works is that there is an instructor's manual that outlines like the learning goals of the game, the background context, but also the structure of, if you're a teacher, this is how you would implement the game. And then there's a series of role sheets that go to the different factions. And the roles are either students are assigned to the oversight board, and they make the decision on whether to remove or take down the posts in question, or, like I said, they're assigned to one of 5 factions. And these factions are things like the free speech absolutists. They are purely for free speech at all costs. The family values heroes, which are really interested in traditional family values and child protection. There's the human rights champions, which is kind of self-explanatory. The defamation defenders, who are really for over-policing content on social media, and then the neutrality network, which is for a fair and balanced information environment. And the format of the game itself is really a structured classroom debate where each of the factions presents their opening positions, and they are trying to convince the oversight board how they should rule on each of the posts. Should they leave up or take down the posts? And of course, the oversight board and the various factions get a sort of briefing of the case. And where things get a little bit more intense is that in addition to keeping up or taking down each post, each faction has a policy recommendation that they will propose to the oversight board. So for the family values heroes, and I know that the names are a little bit cheesy, but they propose that there should be a child lock clause where the oversight board can recommend to Meta that posts of a similar issue need to be blocked for those under, I think it was 16, or the free speech absolutists who kind of realize that it's unlikely that all the posts are going to stay up online. They will propose that the oversight board recommends to create a transparency archive so that even if posts are taken off of Meta's platforms, they still exist online somewhere and therefore sort of fulfill their mission of promoting free speech at all costs. And the oversight board can only select 2 of these policy recommendations out of the 5 that are proposed to them. So that creates a nice sort of way for each faction to reach their victory objectives or not. Does the oversight board rule along their wishes about leaving up or taking down the posts? And then which policy recommendations do they select or not? So each faction in their role sheets has the position that they should argue for and the policy position they should argue for. And then it's up to the oversight board to decide what they will recommend to Meta and why. And where it gets interesting is that when the oversight board presents its recommendations and its decisions, then each of the factions rates the fairness of that decision on a scale of 1 to 5, and then the teacher can average them. And the oversight board's mission is to receive a fairness rating of over 3. So a little bit over the middle ground. And it's fun because it gets complicated where, of course, the students have their own positions and beliefs, their own personal positions about whether the post should stay up or be removed. But when they see what other factions in society can argue, they come to realize that there isn't really one singular solution here. And so how is the oversight board going to moderate this? And are they going to do this in a fair way? Brings that game-like element into the classroom. And so it's very fun, both for the teacher and for the students to do. But of course, that isn't enough for learning in itself. So in the instructor's manual, there's a series of recommendations for debriefing exercises where students then go off and reflect, write a short, page or 2 reflection about, well, what does it mean to actually be fair in this context when you have a private company sort of dealing with democratic issues? Or how actually should the idea of newsworthiness be described? Because that's a key part of the game where for the oversight board, they can force Meta to keep up a post, even if it violates the company's policies, by bringing in this carve out for newsworthiness, which is, of course, a vague concept. So how do students actually define it? And so it's really coming to terms with the complexity that there is no really one size fits all policy for hate speech or for what should or should not be allowed on social media when you start bringing in context and figures of speech and all the complexity that these companies deal with on a day-to-day basis. So, like I said, there's 2 different scenarios. And what's kind of fun, if you can do it in your classes, is the rulings from the first scenario can then affect the gameplay of the second scenario. And the cases have been chosen so that they both deal with the complexities of figures of speech, again, one from the politician side and one from protester side. So if you play both games, there is this kind of cumulative effect where it gets more complex than just playing one. But of course, if you're pressed for time, one run of the game is certainly enough. And what surprised me is that in running this game, both with students, but also in a couple workshops with teachers in this reacting to the past pedagogy, one thing that they found it really useful for is as an icebreaker or as an introduction into role playing in the classroom. And so that's where I think it could be useful as a workshop exercise, as a fun thing for people to do to get to know each other while actively playing this role and meeting other people in the process in a way that is not just, networking. It's giving people something to do, working towards a common mission, and playing through this game while also learning something about the complexities of social media and politics. So that is the Oversight board game. Now, because it is part of this Reacting to the Past series, and they do invest resources in reviewing the game, in promoting the game, and organizing these various workshops, there is a cost to download the game from them. But of course, if you are interested in getting the materials, just shoot me an email and I'm happy to send those along and hear any feedback for how it goes in your classroom or event. So that's the Oversight board game. And the plan is to potentially keep developing more scenarios as the Oversight board hears more cases, kind of like expansion packs to the game. So we'll see how that goes in the future. But it's been really well received in this Reacting to the Past community. And I think one of the reasons is because most of these games deal with historical cases. So they're really for history students, whereas this game is about something that you don't need to have special knowledge of the Middle Ages or the French Revolution. It's something that we all kind of are familiar with, social media. So it doesn't require any sort of background knowledge to get started and hop right in. Apropos, let me hop right into the third thing I want to discuss in this episode, which is the counterfactual case study. This is an assignment that is a little bit more intensive than the kind of 1 hour Oversight board game. And it's something I developed for a master's course that I teach on called Media and Political Engagement. And I've published the motivation and the materials and the results of this assignment in the Journal of Political Science Education. There's a link to that down in the episode description, which is much more structured than I'll present it here, and also has all of the materials you need to run this assignment in the supplementary material. And what I'd like to talk about first is my motivation for both creating this assignment, but also for trying to publish it. And the motivation was that I wanted to build one of these Reacting to the Past games, but I didn't know how to build a game. And like I said before, most of these games are multi-week assignments that can take a large part of a course. And I just didn't have the capacity to build that game. And I also didn't want to have something that would run over multiple course sessions. But I wanted to still have some type of active learning assignment that keeps the focus on roles, because there's a lot of literature that shows that role playing and taking a different perspective is really powerful in developing these metacognitive skills like critical thinking. And personally, I've thought a lot about this, and I think that it is a great way to sort of reduce bias. And to be a really good critical thinker, the first step is that you step away from what you personally believe and start to evaluate other perspectives as this kind of beachhead to being able to think critically. And I think that roles are a very good way to begin that process, because whenever you take on a role, you detach from yourself and then through reflection start to challenge your own opinions. And that's really important for critical thinking. I think it's a necessary step. And I also think that what I've seen in the classroom, which really surprises me from the bachelor's level up to the master's level, is that students come into the classroom believing that echo chambers and filter bubbles, first, are real, and second, are the source of many ills of society. And so I was trying to think, okay, how can I develop a exercise where by placing students in a role, they have to challenge this really strong opinion that almost all of them have universally. So the result of that, both trying to scale down one of these full-fledged reacting games and incorporating roles, is this counterfactual case study. And basically what it is an assignment where students are given a role in a major historical event, and they need to argue for how that political event would change or not with the inclusion of social media. And the logic there is when you are tasked with rewriting history, can you actually argue that the inclusion of social media would do that? And if you can't, then maybe you have to look at today and say that, oh, social media maybe doesn't have the power that I assign to it, or maybe that there's other more powerful factors that can explain what I think social media is currently explaining. And so the main learning goal of this assignment is to begin understanding and analyzing the contingency between media and politics, which is kind of vague. But what I mean is that it is very difficult to ascribe one outcome to one media technology. And we see this when we look back through history, that of course, certain media platforms have a role in some sort of change in society or politics, but that usually happens alongside of or in tandem with other factors. And so that's what I mean by contingency. How do you locate what is media's role in affecting a political outcome relative to other roles? Can you actually make the argument that it is the media itself that is explaining major political events? So the way this works is that students are broken up into small groups, and each group is given a role in a major historical event. And there's 5 of those events. There is the Protestant Reformation, the American Revolution, the rise of fascism before World War II, the Berlin Wall, and the Iranian Revolution. And so for each of those scenarios, there is a role that represents the challengers, like let's say the Sons of Liberty in the US, and the incumbents or the establishment. So let's say the British monarchy in the American Revolution example. So each group is given a prompt that sort of explains this is their role, and they're given 3 readings that discuss media's role in that event. And this is done at an opening seminar where students get their roles and the teacher walks around and kind of explains and answers any questions around the assignment. And then students go off for about 2 weeks and they formulate their historical cases. And they're also given an instruction packet of what that presentation should entail, which is things like outlining the media landscape at the time, outlining how they think social media would look like in that environment. And then the third part is how they think that social media would affect or not the outcome of that event. And it gets quite interesting because if you think of the Protestant Reformation, for example, you can't just create any sort of social media. People couldn't read if they were peasants, right? So that sort of pushes people towards developing more visual types of communication where something like Instagram might fit in. And in the instructions, it's clear for students that they are at liberty to develop their own social media platform and their own social media environment, or they can use platforms from today, as long as they have an argument for why those platforms look like the way they do and why people use them for politics in the way that they do. So students get these instructions and their starter readings and their roles at the opening seminar. And then it's always fun at the end of the seminar to say that, oh, by the way, there is another faction who represents the other side of your scenario. And so that's great when the students present because they get to see how another group has interpreted the same event from a different perspective. And it's also a way to kind of motivate them to take this seriously. It's this idea of peer accountability that of course, they could not put so much effort into their presentation, but then they have to get up next to another group. And it's that kind of motivating factor of trying to have a better argument than the other team that came through in the evaluations for this assignment. So what I do in the study is I report how the assignment was changed from its first run in 2022 and its second run in 2024 in a way that seemed to increase learning for students. And the way that I measured that was by asking students to fill in an assignment evaluation survey that had some kind of scaled questions around, how much did you enjoy the assignment, 1 to 7, I think it was, as well as some open text responses to, what was the most important thing you learned, for example. And a good tip that I found by reading a different study was to help motivate students to respond is to go out and get like a 20, 25 euro gift card to a restaurant and then raffle that off to one lucky winner and as a little bit of a bonus for anyone who filled in the survey, they received a Social Media and Politics podcast sticker, which is a little bit of extra motivation. And I'll get to the results of those surveys in just a second, but I want to talk about what came through the presentations first, because it was something that was really interesting and something I hadn't expected was that because the nature of the assignment is a counterfactual, students had to make hypotheses to complete the assignment. So because social media wasn't available during any of these historical events, there's no right or wrong answer. You have to argue for how social media would affect the outcome of this event. And by doing that, you are formulating hypotheses, even if you don't really know what a formal hypothesis is. So just as one example from the Protestant Reformation case, they argued that the process of globalization would be expedited as people became aware to experiences outside of their immediate surroundings. So because of social media, the process of globalization would be expedited. And here's the reason for why. And that's important to report, I think, because our master's program is very qualitative and there's no sort of hypothesis formulations that we generally see in master's theses because they're usually interview based. But it was clear that across most, if not all, of the presentations, there were hypothesis statements in there, but they weren't formulated explicitly as hypotheses. So that was something I thought, okay, maybe I can build on that for the next time that this assignment runs. So that was my interpretation from the teacher side, but then there's also what the students reported in the assignment evaluations. And I just want to focus on the two key points that emerged here, which was there was a difference between students' enjoyment of the assignment and how much better prepared they felt to analyze media's role in politics. So I don't have the exact percentages in front of me, but most students reported that they really liked the assignment and they felt like they learned a lot, but they didn't feel more prepared to analyze media's role in politics. So there was this kind of discrepancy between enjoyment and what I call efficacy, that they felt better prepared. And so I was going through the open text responses about what they felt they learned, and a lot of them reported they learned a lot. They felt motivated, they enjoyed it, it was fun, and they learned a lot. But the question is actually, what did they learn? And I think in hindsight, they learned a lot about history, but they didn't learn a lot about analytical techniques to get at this idea of contingency and breaking down media's role in explaining political outcomes. And what really motivated me to revise this assignment was actually two very critical comments that I got, which was one that really prompted me to think exactly what I was just talking about, where a student said, if I have to be 100% honest, I am still not sure exactly what I learned. It was a fun and creative task, but it didn't feel very challenging on an academic level. And then one that was much more critical. This is something that might be entertaining for high school students, but amongst the 30-ish-year-olds in grad school, the task is underwhelming at best. So I sort of had these conflicting comments of a lot of students appreciated the learning and the fun, but when it came down to brass tacks, they didn't really feel that they were in any better position to analyze this contingency that I wanted them to be better at. So after thinking about, okay, what do I need to do? I implemented in the second version of the assignment, which was 2 years later, a debriefing seminar where students read about process tracing, and in particular, tracing causal mechanisms. So the idea for this was that, okay, students are kind of developing hypotheses. Can I help them formalize these hypotheses into real expectations? And how can I do that in a way that's still qualitative? And so that brought me to process tracing, and in particular, the work of Derek Beach, who's at Aarhus, where he has this great article about what is a mechanism and how can we trace and explain outcomes by identifying the causal mechanism. And he's got a kind of rubric for placing cause, effect, and then various stages that show a mechanism. So for the second version of the assignment, I thought, all right, students are going to make hypotheses. now we're going to have a seminar where we learn what process tracing is, what we learn what a causal mechanism is, and then you're going to go back to your historical case study and you're going to identify what is the causal mechanism that explains your deviation from the real historical record, which sounds like a mouthful. But what emerged from both runs of this assignment is that students actually did not find themselves able to argue that social media would drastically change the outcome of their event. The vast majority of scenarios ended up with the same conclusion. That is, this event would have happened a couple years earlier or a couple years later, but we can't really argue that the entire course of history would have changed. So in the process tracing, what I ask the students to do is say, okay, you've argued that this event will speed up or slow down. What is the specific reason? What is the causal mechanism for that change in the historical record? What this does is, first of all, students feel that they are learning a new method of process tracing. They feel like they are learning more about cause and effect, and they're learning how to generate a better hypothesis. But even more than that, the really important point, and what I talk about in the study, is that it allows them to use the work they've already developed and synthesize it. Because what happens in these presentations is that students spend so much effort on describing all the ins and outs of their social media platforms, and they devise these such intricate scenarios, they kind of lose the main argument that they're making, which is, would this change the event or not? And by going back and spending some time reflecting on their work and boiling down exactly what is the mechanism that they are arguing changes the historical record, they strip away all the non-important stuff and focus on their core arguments. And this came through very clearly in the second round of the assignment evaluations, where students said things like, the process tracing worked like a mind map for us to organize the disordered ideas. It was a powerful tool that allowed me to organize all the key actors. One even argued that if we don't do a process tracing, our knowledge is just stuck on the surface, because it's precisely this ordering of all this mapping they've done about their historical case into a simple argument that it is this specific causal mechanism that we are arguing delays the American Revolution by 5 years, or something to that effect. And where this is important for the scholarship of teaching and learning is that it points to the importance of debriefing, not just having students do something, but having them come back and reflect upon their work. And within the theory of active learning, there are two sides to active learning. One is the instructor side of giving students something to do, and then the demand side of active learning, which is that students actively reflect upon their work. And that active reflection has somewhat been lost in what active learning means today. Active learning today just means any type of instructional technique that's on a lecture. But if you go back to the origins of active learning back in the 90s, they really stressed that it's about student reflection. And what this debriefing task that I added in 2024 did is it said, okay, you have this very elaborate scenario, but strip away the unimportant stuff and come up with your core argument as to, you already have your outcome, you already have your cause, which is social media. What is your hypothesis that relates to the mechanism that is actually driving the change in your outcome due to X? So there's much more about this in the paper, but just to illustrate what I'm talking about, I'm looking at a student example here where this is from the American Revolution case. Their mechanisms were the circulation of ideas, the collective planning of resistance activities, and crackdowns to those resistance activities. Those are the mechanisms that led to the outbreak of the American Revolution happening earlier, for example. So it's really this idea of distilling all these arguments into really, what are the important ones and which are the ones that you can make hypotheses about. And this really resonated with students because when I look at the survey responses, what I found regarding enjoyment is actually that it was lower. Students did not enjoy this task so much because they had a lot more work to do with this debriefing assignment. But there was a 15% increase in students agreeing with the statement that they felt better prepared to analyze media's role in politics. And those agreements were always in the strongly agree category. So the debriefing exercise really did something that seems to signal that learning increased. But of course, it is very, very difficult to measure learning. And these are self-reports. But I think it does point to something. And it does make sense that by having students produce their own material and then go back and synthesize that into a more concrete argument, that is, I think, where the learning happens. And that's what I think actually makes the learning active, rather than just giving students fun things to do. So that is the counterfactual case study. Again, it's much more clearly outlined in the paper, and the supplementary material has all the instructions and roll sheets that you need to run it. I don't think I discuss it so well in the paper, but my position about this assignment is that the creation of the case study itself, the idea that you get a role and you get some readings and you have to formulate a case around social media's role in affecting this outcome, this is something I think that can be done across all levels. It could be bachelor's, master's, or PhD. It's really the debriefing seminar that can be downscaled or upscaled in difficulty to match the level of learning that you're teaching. So for example, the debriefing exercise in a bachelor's assignment could be more, take your case and reflect upon what are the key actors, who's really necessary and driving change versus unnecessary or peripheral. Whereas at the master's level, you could run this type of generate this causal mechanism table using Beach as an example. Whereas at the PhD level, it could be something like, okay, well, formulate this into a hypothesis and propose how exactly you would study this, what sources of data, and in fact, could you find them today, going back to what type of records are out there. So debriefing is where the learning happens. Debriefing can be upscaled or downscaled, but I think that the bones of the assignment and the basic structure of having to argue for social media's impact is definitely fun, but less valuable for learning without that debriefing component. All right, so that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for listening this far, and feel free to get in touch if you have any questions about teaching or otherwise. I will say that I'm super stoked. I have 4 or 5 really exciting episodes planned to record before the end of the year, so we'll return back to regular programming very soon. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Melba. See you next time.